You can have your version in the television version. And so there is a version that played on television that has the, in my opinion, the correct tempo of the door closing, but not in the theatrical version.
In the summer of 1983, a movie about a teenager, a modem, and the end of the world walked into theaters, and nobody was quite prepared for it. It felt real in a way most films didn't, and it turned out there was a very good reason for that. These are WarGames, 1983, 15 Secrets Hidden for Decades. Secret 15, the alternate endings that were written and then abandoned.
7. Come on. Learn, goddammit.
The ending that audiences saw in June 1983, WOPR teaching itself that nuclear war has no winner by playing out every possible scenario in tic-tac-toe, then powering down, was not the only conclusion Lawrence Lasker and Walter Parkes wrote for the film. Earlier drafts carried endings that were considerably darker, and the decision to abandon them shaped the entire emotional tone of the final film. In one of the most documented alternate conclusions from early screenplay drafts, nuclear war actually begins. WOPR launches. The missiles go. The film did not pull back from the consequence at the last moment. It let the consequence happen. That ending was eventually set aside because the producers and studio felt it left audiences with no way out, no reason to carry the film's message beyond the theater. A story about the madness of nuclear brinkmanship needed to end with a possibility of reason prevailing, not with confirmation that it couldn't. A second alternate conclusion involved David failing to reach Falcon in time, leaving the burden of stopping WOPR entirely on the military. The same institution that had spent the whole film being outmaneuvered by a machine it didn't understand. That version was rejected on dramatic grounds. The story only worked if the kid who started the problem was the one who finished it. What replaced both conclusions was the tic-tac-toe sequence, Falcon's idea, carried out by David at the terminal, forcing WOPR into an unwinnable loop until it reached its own conclusion. It was warmer, more hopeful, and built to fit what Badham was constructing once he took over. The bleaker versions stayed in the drafts, discarded before most people ever knew they had existed. Secret 14, John Lennon was in line for the role of Falcon and had expressed interest.
I saw a documentary on television about Stephen Hawking and the work that he was doing, which promised to finish what Einstein had started in terms of unifying all the knowledge of the cosmos.
The character of Dr. Stephen Falcon, the reclusive, world-weary computer scientist who created the WOPR system and withdrew from civilization after his son's death, was not originally conceived as the character John Wood played in the finished film. In the earliest drafts of the screenplay, Falcon was based directly on Stephen Hawking. Lasker and Parkes wrote him as a dying genius in a motorized wheelchair, an astrophysicist of extraordinary intelligence who had created something the world was not ready for. When it came to who should play this kind of figure, the writers had a very specific person in mind. Walter Parkes later described the choice as obvious to them both. John Lennon, whom Parkes called a kind of spiritual cousin to Stephen Hawking. They communicated with Lennon through the music executive David Geffen, and Lennon indicated he was interested in the role. Lawrence Lasker later recalled the exact moment the plan fell apart. He was working on a scene, writing the first time the audience meets Falcon, and was staring at the November 1980 cover of Esquire magazine, which featured Lennon's face, using it to write the character's physical description. A friend called him with the news that Lennon had been shot and killed outside the Dakota Building in New York. It was December 8, 1980. The scene Lasker had been writing stopped mid-sentence. The role eventually went to British stage actor John Wood, who also voiced the WOPR computer. The wheelchair was quietly removed from the character by Martin Brest, who felt a disabled scientist in the NORAD war room would remind audiences too strongly of Peter Sellers' Dr. Strangelove. The character that survived, a cynical recluse on an island, resigned to the world's self-destructive tendencies, retained the spiritual weight the writers had imagined for Lennon. Secret 13, the real hacker who inspired the script, went by the name Captain Crunch.
The script took about a year, which, given the amount of research, wasn't insane.
After a year passed, I didn't hear anything. I said to the woman who was running our company,
Before Lawrence Lasker and Walter Parks had written a word of the screenplay, they went looking for the people who actually did what their story was about. One of the people they found was John Draper, a hacker who had achieved a specific kind of early notoriety for discovering that a toy whistle included in boxes of Cap'n Crunch cereal produced a tone at exactly 2,600 hertz, the precise frequency used by AT&T's long-distance switching systems. Using that whistle, Draper had found a way to make free long-distance phone calls by manipulating the phone company's own infrastructure. He became known in hacking circles as Captain Crunch. Draper was one of several people Lasker and Parks interviewed in their research on how telephone networks and early computer systems could actually be accessed without authorization. The writers wanted to understand, from people who had actually done it, how a teenage hacker would go about breaking into systems. That research shaped the screenplay in specific ways. The war dialing sequence, David's computer methodically calling number after number, hunting for a modem connection, was drawn from actual hacker practice. The idea that someone could access NORAD through a publicly listed modem line connected to an insecure network was not invented for dramatic convenience. The writers found it was something close to the truth. Secret 12. The writers also discovered real NORAD vulnerabilities during research.
Here, Joe.
Sir, we have a radar tracking. 8 inbound Soviet ICBMs, already over the pole, estimated impact 11 minutes, confirmed target area, western United States.
Why didn't we get a launch detection?
I'm not sure, sir. We're checking for DSP malfunction.
The research that Lasker and Parks conducted during the writing of the screenplay took them places they had not entirely expected. Among the things they found while investigating how plausible their premise actually was, they learned that NORAD maintained open modem lines specifically to allow officers to work from home on weekends. Those lines were not secured in any meaningful way. The technical barrier between a civilian with a modem and NORAD's computer infrastructure was considerably lower than anyone on the outside would have assumed. That finding alone was disturbing enough. But what made it more significant was what happened after the film came out. The vulnerabilities Lasker and Parks had uncovered through their research were not anomalies. They were representative of a much broader problem inside the government's computer infrastructure. The screenwriters had stumbled into something real while trying to make their story plausible, and the story they built from it turned out to be, in the most important respects, accurate. Secret 11. The Air Force actively tried to stop the film from being made.
BMUS has continuous radar tracking on inbounds. Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high.
The United States Air Force did not want WarGames to exist. When the production sought to work with the military in any advisory capacity, as films often did, and still do, the Air Force refused and went further, actively opposing the making and release of the film altogether. The concern was specific. The Air Force believed the film's premise, in which a teenager penetrates NORAD's computer systems and nearly triggers a nuclear war by accident, would amplify public fears that the world could be pushed into nuclear conflict through an error or a prank rather than a deliberate act. That was not a reassuring message for a military institution trying to project an image of absolute control. The Air Force wanted the public to believe its systems were impenetrable. The fact that they were, as the post-release government review confirmed, genuinely vulnerable made the opposition feel less like caution and more like an attempt to suppress something inconvenient. The production moved forward without any military cooperation. Secret 10. The NORAD set was the most expensive ever built at the time.
This rather large room here is the command center for NORAD. No picture taking. These screens you see in front of you connected to our satellites and missile tracking stations throughout the country.
The command center set that served as the film's primary interior location was not a dressed-up existing space or a modified real facility. It was built entirely from the ground up by production designer Angelo Graham and his team, working without any access to the actual NORAD installation in Colorado, which the Air Force had made clear was not going to be made available. What Graham built instead was an invention, a sprawling, technologically detailed war room that looked more convincingly like a real command center than anything that had appeared in a film before it. According to a 1983 featurette produced before the film's release, the NORAD War Room set cost over $4.5 million to construct, the most expensive single set ever built in American filmmaking at that point. Every detail had to be fabricated without reference to the classified real thing, using only publicly available information and imagination. The result was so convincing, it influenced the visual design of other productions for years, including Independence Day in 1996. Secret 9. Matthew Broderick had to learn to type for the role.
They change the password every couple of weeks, but I know where they write it down.
Matthew Broderick was 20 years old when WarGames went into production, and he was not a computer person. His background was theater. He had appeared on Broadway in Harvey Fierstein's Torch Song trilogy, and the technical requirements of playing a teenage hacker in 1982 presented a specific practical problem. David Lightman spent enormous amounts of screen time in front of keyboards, typing with apparent fluency and confidence. Broderick needed to look like someone who had been doing this his whole life. The studio arranged for a Galaga arcade machine to be delivered to Broderick's home, on the logic that the character's comfort with technology needed to feel physical and instinctive rather than performed. He practiced on it until the relationship between his hands and the controls looked natural. He also learned to type properly, not the two-finger pecking of someone new to keyboards, but the fluid, confident typing of a kid who genuinely lived at a computer. John Badham, who took over the direction after Martin Brest was removed, worked specifically with Broderick and Ali Sheedy to make the young cast seem genuinely at ease, energized and curious rather than frightened and serious. The distinction mattered enormously to how the film felt. Secret 8. Ali Sheedy was not the obvious choice for Jennifer.
I read it and I really loved it, but I just needed to work and get my foot in the door. So I was also auditioning for and reading things that, were pretty bad. And this one was just really, really good. I auditioned for it for 4 months.
When you saw Allie, you loved her.
Ali Sheedy was cast as Jennifer, the girl who tags along with David and becomes his partner through the crisis. But her path to the role was not straightforward. She had appeared in small parts and had done theater work, but she was not a name that the studio was particularly excited about when her name came up. The casting of the two young leads was, by several accounts, one of the more uncertain parts of the pre-production period. What Sheedy brought to the role was a specific quality of naturalism. She didn't play Jennifer as someone who understood what was happening around her, because Jennifer didn't understand it. She played the character's bewilderment and attraction to David as the primary emotional reality of her scenes. And it worked, because Badham gave the two of them room to develop a chemistry that felt unforced. WarGames established what she could do with a camera in front of her, and The Breakfast Club the following year confirmed it. Secret 7. The script spent years being rejected before anyone said yes.
I don't know what you think you could do here, Stephen.
John, good to see you. You see, the wife still picks your ties.
What has this kid been telling you?
Lawrence Lasker and Walter Parks had been working on the WarGames concept since at least 1979. The development period was long and frustrating, and the screenplay they eventually produced was rejected by studio after studio before anyone agreed to make it. Executives who read the script were consistently uncertain about whether audiences would believe that a teenager with a home computer could genuinely threaten global security. The premise seemed too implausible, too technical, and too dependent on an audience that understood computers, which, in the late 1970s and very early 1980s, was still a vanishingly small percentage of the movie-going public. United Artists was eventually the studio that agreed to take the project on, though even they proceeded with enough skepticism that they attached Martin Brest as director and then fired him 3 weeks into filming. The skepticism about the premise turned out to be misplaced in almost every direction. Audiences in 1983 were far more ready for a story about computer hacking than anyone had calculated, partly because home computers and video games had been spreading through American households for 2 or 3 years by then. The film grossed $124.6 million worldwide against a $12 million budget. It was nominated for 3 Academy Awards for Best Original Screenplay, Best Cinematography, and Best Sound, and won a BAFTA for Best Sound. Secret 6. The screenplay was partly inspired by a real 1979 NORAD incident.
Radar reports 2 unknown tracks are penetrating the Alaskan air defense zone.
Confidence is high.
Flight profile suggests Soviet backfire bombers.
I want a visual confirmation on that. Scramble 2 F-16s out of Galena.
Sure.
The plot of WarGames, in which a false reading in a computer system nearly triggers a nuclear launch based on data that did not represent reality, was not purely invented. Lasker and Parks were aware of a specific real event from November 9, 1979, in which NORAD's warning systems detected what appeared to be 1,400 incoming Soviet ballistic missiles. For several terrifying minutes, American nuclear forces were on heightened alert while officials tried to determine whether the readings were real. They were not. The alarm had been triggered by a training tape loaded into the wrong system. A simulation meant for an exercise had been mistaken for actual incoming data. The incident lasted approximately 6 minutes before it was correctly identified as an error. It was exactly the kind of catastrophic systems confusion that the WarGames screenplay was built around. A computer generating information that looked like an attack, with human operators uncertain whether to treat it as real. The writers did not dramatize the 1979 incident directly, but the knowledge that something like it had already happened gave their premise a foundation that pure fiction wouldn't have had. The world they were describing in their screenplay was not entirely imaginary. Secret 5. The film coined the term hacker for a mass audience.
Oh, hey, you got it back.
Gotta make a note of that one. Might come in handy someday.
Before WarGames arrived in theaters in the summer of 1983, the word hacker existed in computing circles as a fairly neutral term describing someone who explored and manipulated systems with skill and curiosity. It was an insider word, known to the people who worked with computers and to a handful of journalists who covered the technology industry. It was not a household word. WarGames changed that. The film reached an audience of tens of millions across the United States and internationally, and it gave those millions of people a vivid, specific, and sympathetic picture of what a hacker was. A bright, restless kid who found computers more interesting than school and who could navigate systems that adults couldn't understand. That image, teenager, bedroom computer, modem, insatiable curiosity, became the template through which mainstream America understood hacking for years afterward. Security researchers and technology historians have noted that the film directly inspired a generation of people who went on to work in computing and cybersecurity. Jeff Moss, who founded the DEF CON hacking conference in 1992, cited the film as one of the things that motivated him to pursue the field. He even named the conference after the DEF CON nuclear alert levels that appear prominently in the movie. Secret 4. The film premiered at Cannes before its American release.
You kids think you own this place?
Oh, I was just looking around.
You know you're not supposed to leave the group, don't you?
Yes.
So why don't you get back there?
Okay, excuse me. Thank you very much, sir.
WarGames did not open cold in American theaters. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival on May 7, 1983, nearly a month before its June 3 American release date. That choice, taking a summer thriller aimed substantially at a teenage audience to one of the most prestigious film festivals in the world, reflected something about how the producers and distributors understood the film. It was not just a popcorn movie. It was a film about nuclear anxiety and technological vulnerability that happened to also be exciting and funny and accessible. The Cannes premiere generated serious attention and positioned the film as something worth taking seriously before anyone had seen it commercially. The film earned 3 Academy Award nominations at the 56th Academy Awards for Best Original Screenplay, Best Cinematography for William A. Fraker, and Best Sound, and won a BAFTA Award for Best Sound. It grossed $124.6 million worldwide against a $12 million budget, making the years of studio rejections look like one of the more comprehensively wrong institutional judgments of the decade. Secret 3. The director was fired. 3 weeks in, and some of his footage is still in the film.
So then we went about searching for a director, and I knew Marty Brest from AFI days, and I gave him a copy of the script, and he really liked it, and the studio was adamant that Marty was the director.
The WarGames that opened in theaters was not the film being shot for the first 3 weeks of production. Martin Brest was the original director. He had made a strong impression with his 1979 comedy Going in Style and was considered one of the more exciting young directors around. But once filming began, his vision pulled in a direction nobody else wanted to follow. Brest wanted a darker film, a heavier tone, and a central character he envisioned as college-aged rather than a teenager. The writers pushed back hard on that last point. Lasker and Parks felt a 21-year-old skulking around computer equipment simply wasn't charming the way a kid would be. Brest also brought in his own writer, Wally Green, to rewrite significant sections of the screenplay, deepening the friction with the original writers. The footage coming in, darker in look, more serious in tone, made United Artists nervous. After roughly 3 weeks, producer Leonard Goldberg dismissed Brest, citing creative differences. John Badham came in to replace him, and the film was rebuilt around a lighter, faster energy. What most people don't know is that Badham did not simply throw out everything Brest had shot. Some of that early footage was kept and cut into the final film. The precise scenes have never been fully documented, but Badham and the producers confirmed that a portion of what audiences saw in theaters was shot by the man who got fired. Without knowing it, viewers of the released film were watching the work of 2 directors with fundamentally opposite ideas about what the movie should be. Secret 2. The original concept started with a dying scientist, not a teen hacker.
The cosmos. And I thought that given his condition, ALS, I imagined a point at which he had figured out the answer, but he would be immobilized and couldn't communicate it to anyone.
The earliest version of what became WarGames was a significantly different film. When Lasker and Parks began developing the concept in 1979, the story they were working on centered on a dying genius, an astrophysicist based on Stephen Hawking, who was passing his knowledge to a young protege before his death. The hacker premise as it eventually developed, with David Lightman as the central figure and the WOPR computer as the threat, came later. The original concept was more intimate and elegiac, concerned with the transmission of genius from one generation to the next, rather than with Cold War brinkmanship. As the story evolved, the Hawking-inspired scientist became a supporting character. Falcon, the creator of Whopper, who retreats from the world after his son dies, and the system he built becomes an instrument of war. The young protagonist became the hacker David, and the story became about him. That shift transformed a quiet story about mortality into a thriller about computers and nuclear catastrophe. And both ideas remained present in the finished film, even as their balance shifted completely. Secret 1. Reagan's question to his general led directly to America's first cybersecurity policy.
Look, I don't have time for a conversation right now.
General, are you prepared to destroy the enemy?
You betcha.
Do you think they know that?
I believe we've made that clear enough.
Then don't.
The chain of events that WarGames set in motion in the real world outside of theaters is one of the more remarkable stories in the history of American popular culture and policy. When President Reagan watched the film at Camp David in the summer of 1983, he was disturbed enough by what he saw to bring it up at a White House meeting on June 8th with congressional leaders and his national security advisors. He described the film's premise and turned to General John Vesey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and asked the direct question, could something like this really happen? Vesey took the question seriously and went away to find out. When he came back, his answer was not reassuring. The government's computer systems were, he told the president, significantly more vulnerable than the movie had depicted, a conclusion that the earlier work of Lasker and Parks in their research had already pointed toward, but that nobody in the government had formally assessed. The answer set off a formal review process that moved through the relevant agencies over the following year. In September 1984, Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 145, establishing the first national policy on securing telecommunications and automated information systems. It was the nascent foundation of what eventually became modern government cybersecurity infrastructure. A film that studios had spent years refusing to make, directed by a replacement director brought in after the original was fired, had directly prompted the United States government to create its first formal framework for protecting its computer systems. WarGames was shot in the shadow of two directors, built around a script that nobody wanted to fund, and nearly became a completely different film than the one that came out. The NORAD set was the most expensive ever built in Hollywood at the time. John Lennon was meant to be in it and was actively interested in the role before he was killed. The research that went into writing the screenplay helped expose real vulnerabilities in the country's nuclear defenses. The teenager sitting in a darkened theater in the summer of 1983, watching Matthew Broderick nearly end the world by typing on a keyboard, may well have been one of the people who went on to build the systems that protect us today. If this one was worth your time, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another look behind the screen at the stories that shaped what we watched.